Exodus 3. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame out of the fire of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight, and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings. And I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to the Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He said, I will be with you, and it shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. But Moses said to God, If I come to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is my name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said further, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you.
Last week we started a journey through the book of Exodus. Take a little deeper look at some of the stories and themes that run through the book. And last week we talked about there are kind of three major themes in Exodus. There's probably a lot more, but I kind of picked up on these three. And the first one being that God is active in redeeming the life of God's people, which means for us that God is still active in our lives today. Also, a good theme is that God chose the Israelites to be His people, to be kind of His representative, His shining light on the earth. And that kind of means that we too, who choose to follow God, are also His example of His love and His grace on earth. And the third theme was that God is present amongst His people. And you kind of see maybe one theme running through all three of them is that God is here with us. God is working through us. God wants to be part of our lives, which is something we'll see over and over again in the book of Exodus. As I said last week, one commentator stated that if you want to understand the whole Bible, understand and read the book of Exodus. And the themes that you see running through there will be repeated again and again. Last week we started with the story of Moses. We remember that Moses was born a Hebrew who were slaves in Egypt at the time. And he was saved miraculously by being floated in a basket of reeds and was raised by one of Pharaoh's daughters. And we know that Moses ended up fleeing Egypt because he saw the Egyptians, an Egyptian slave master beating one of his fellow Hebrews, and he killed him. And he flees because he's worried about Pharaoh's retribution, of course. Well, to further our story, Moses ends up fleeing to Midian. Now, Midian might not mean much, but it's kind of interesting that the Midian people are nomadic people called the Midianites. And they're named after one of Abraham's sons from a second wife, Keturah. If you didn't know that Abraham married another wife after Sarah died. So the Midianites are the people, the ancestors of Abraham's son Midian. But they're also the same people that bought Joseph when he was sold into slavery, or sold to them by his brothers. His brothers threw Joseph down the well, and they decided instead of leaving him to die, they sold him into slavery. the Midianites who purchased Joseph. Kind of just another way the Bible kind of weaves its way together there between Genesis and Exodus. So Moses goes and finds himself staying with the Midianites. There he meets Jethro and begins kind of working for him, and eventually he marries Jethro's daughter, Zipporah. Then he has two sons named Gershom, which means stranger in a strange land, as Moses was. He was a stranger in that land. Another son named Eleazar, which means my God is my help. Named appropriately because God delivered Moses and saved him. So here in the story we get to today, Moses is living in Midian. He's married, he has two sons, he's a shepherd, working with his father-in-law Jethro. And today we get the story of Moses in the burning bush. There are some pretty cool things, I think, in this story. The first in this whole story is I didn't realize that the life of Moses is divided into three segments. 3 40-year segments. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that Moses was exactly 40 years when he left Egypt, and then he was 80 when he first went to this burning bush, and then he spent the last 40 years as being a king or kind of leading his people finally through the wilderness. Because in the biblical times, 40 kind of signifies a long time. We have the 40 days that it rained with the flood. We have the Israelites that spend the 40 years wandering in the wilderness. It doesn't necessarily literally mean 40 years. It means a good chunk of time. But in Moses' case, it may have meant 40 years. But in anything, we hear that Moses is 80 years old. Let's take it as it says. He's been around for a while, if you want to look at it that way, when he receives this call from God to lead his people. It's important to notice that Moses was born. He was saved miraculously. His life was made and ready to save his Israelite brethren, his Hebrew people. But he certainly took a while before God actually answered or helped fulfill what he was born to do. No matter if he was exactly 80 or not, he had been around for a while. He had experienced some things. God's call in his life didn't necessarily come right away. He went through a few other things, which is a good lesson for us to remember that even though we may be doing something right now, it doesn't mean that God can't call us to something else. Even if we've been doing what we are doing for as long as we have, it doesn't mean that God is done with us, or that God may be calling us to do something else. Another important thing to note is that Moses was a shepherd. That's a pretty poor job for what he grew up and was educated to do. He grew up as an Egyptian, so he had all of their education, all of their wealth, all of their status. Yet he finds himself doing shepherd's work, which no Egyptian person would probably find themselves doing. They had other people doing that for him. But he was content to do it. He was happy. It was employment, is what he did, is what he had found, where he had found his life and his wife, and he had chose to do that work and to do it well. I read that and it helped remind me, because sometimes I get jealous. Sometimes I think, wouldn't it be cool to get up Sunday and to preach to a basketball arena full of thousands upon people? Wouldn't it be cool to have written a few books read by some people who had my name on the best-selling list of New York bestsellers? Wouldn't it be nice to have, whatever, a giant place to worship, all other kinds of things. Sometimes I think that way. I think sometimes all of us get stuck in that thinking where, wouldn't it be neat if I was more recognized for what I did? Wouldn't it be neat to have my name on the marquee? Wouldn't it be famous? That's not what God calls us to be. Bigger is not always better. In fact, there was a quote I found in the commentaries that I had never heard that has stuck with me. And it said, Moses saw more of God in a desert than ever he had seen in Pharaoh's court. Moses saw more of God in a desert than he ever saw in Pharaoh's court. Which I think means that sometimes we get stuck where we're comfortable. We get stuck where our lives are, and things are going along pretty good, and we kind of forget a little bit about God sometimes, or we don't always reach out to God because things are going along smoothly. We kind of have everything we need, or everything we need certainly, and a lot of times we have everything we want. And sometimes it's hard for us to stop and to hear or find God. But here's Moses, away from all of that noise and bustle of Egypt, tending sheep, and he hears the word of God. And that reminds me that God calls each of us to different places. It reminds me that I'm never going to get a New York bestsellers list because I'm never going to sit down and write a book. Zero desire to ever do that. I'm never going to preach to thousands of people in a basketball arena because I certainly don't want to do that. I don't want to live in a big city. God has called, for myself, me here. God has called us to where we are. There are amazing things that can be done through us. We've all heard of Billy Graham and the work that he's done. A professor or somebody once asked me, who was more important, Billy Graham or the person who introduced Billy Graham to Jesus and got him started down that path? We don't know where our lives can be effective or who we can change. I think that's the first lesson that we can learn through this, is that we are called to do the work where we are at. It doesn't have to be the noisy place, the big place, the fancy place. God calls us where we're at to do what we need to do. Moses was a humble shepherd. He was in the desert when he started to really experience God and the power of God. Another thing we need to remember is that Moses turned aside when he saw the burning bush. Meaning Moses turned and looked and thought, that's weird. There's a bush on fire. It's not being consumed. And he goes and he checks it out. He had to stop what he was doing and go investigate a little bit. And notice, God doesn't have a nice grand tree. He doesn't have a giant pillar of fire. Doesn't have a real nice burn pit with a real nice brick exterior, nice altar where the fire is burning. He's got a bush. And if you look closely at the word, it's a thorny bush. So it's not even a nice bush that's on fire. Again, reminding us of the humbleness of God and the humble people that God calls to do God's work. So Moses turns and he says, I'm going to check out why that bush is on fire. He could have easily said, I'm seeing things, or could have looked at it, ignored it, not investigated very closely, and walked on. But, I've got sheep to take care of, I've got a job to do. The wife's called me back home to fix this in the house. My boys are probably getting in trouble again. There's all kinds of things I got to take care of. I just don't have time to deal with whatever that is over there. And I think that's a lesson for us also. I know it is. He took notice of the bush. He turned aside to see it. He left his business that he was doing, and he went to investigate, and God called him. Because Moses turned and answered, he got to speak directly to God. It says that those that seek God will find him. Those that draw closer to God, God will draw closer to them. Just as Moses could have found any excuse to say, I just don't have time. I'll come back. If it's burning tomorrow, when I come back, I'll check it out. Maybe after a couple years after my boys are grown, I'll come back and see if that bush is still on fire. Maybe after I get this list of things done, I'll come back and I'll answer that call. Moses stopped right then, right there, and said, what do you want, God? A lesson for me and a lesson for all of us. Where it's so easy with the schedules, with anything, how busy we find ourselves to be, to say, not now, God. You're certainly not asking me to do this. I have got X, Y, and Z to take care of. But maybe later. Maybe some other time. So if Moses would have passed by and not said anything, does that mean God would have found someone else to lead his people? Possibly. Maybe God would have continued to call him and continued to find ways to try and break into his life until Moses finally said yes. I think both things are possible for us. I think there are times in our lives when we know God is calling us to do something and we flat out say, no, I can't, or I don't think I can, or whatever the excuse may be. And I think God might say, okay, you'll miss this blessing, you'll miss this part of your life, whatever it may have been. I think there are other times when we can say no and God will continually try and break in until eventually we say yes. But what we learn from Moses and what we can learn from any is that God wants to be part of our lives. But to do so, we have to stop and turn aside and say, okay, God, what do you want me to do? It might not be write a bestseller. It might not be lead worship. It might not be anything too spectacular besides saying yes to volunteer somewhere. It might just be being nicer to your spouse or your kids. It might be finding a way to volunteer at the school. It might be whatever it could be. God has a plan for all of us. And when we say yes, it doesn't mean the road's going to be easy. Lord knows Moses says he's going to have a lot of issues as we continue on. But think of what he would have missed out upon. Speaking directly to God, seeing his people finally saved, and eventually seeing where they're going to go into the promised land. I bet if we were to ask Moses if he wishes, he would have said yes or no when that burning bush was burning. If he would have had a chance to take it back and maybe not answer, my guess would be he enjoyed the ride. He enjoyed the blessing God did through him. He enjoyed what he had to do. Did he enjoy it all the time? As we see later in the story, no. He had some issues. But I think the experience overall would have outweighed the issues that he had. So last thing I think we can pick up from Moses is that he approaches God. He says, yes, I'll follow him, but he takes his shoes off and approaches God in reverence, out of awe. In that Near Eastern time, he took his shoes off as a sign of respect. Same thing we do now in kind of removing our hats in buildings or when the anthem is played. It's just a sign of respect. And it's a reminder that we worship and we serve a God that is awe-inspiring. That is something that we ought to approach out of a little bit of fear, because God is so powerful, a little bit of love, and a little bit of reverence. But another thing that Moses did in taking off his shoes is in that time and still now, is that you take your shoes off when you enter a home. And Moses really had no home until he finally answered God's call. He was a stranger living in Egypt. He was then a stranger living amongst the Midianites because they thought him as an Egyptian. He couldn't go back to his Hebrews because they were scared of him too because of his Egyptian upbringing. He had no place to call home until he finally answered God's call. So there at the foot of that mountain, Moses the alien found a true home because he decided to turn aside and say yes to God. So Moses and his call is a story really for all of us. We are all called to follow God. We are all called with different gifts. We are called to say yes at different times and do different things. It's important that we do turn aside. It's important that we don't compare what we're doing to what our neighbor is doing, because God has called each of us differently to use different gifts. The important thing is what is our answer? And sometimes that answer may be difficult. Read further in the story, Moses has all kinds of issues. I can't go, God. I can't talk very well. What am I gonna say your name is, God? And God has answers for him. He says, here's Aaron to help you out, your brother. Tell him that I am what I am, or I'll be what I will be. First time God uses the name Yahweh in the Bible. We don't have to worry about being good enough, because the power behind us to do it is the power of the entire universe, the Creator, and God and Jesus. Instead of a list of excuses of why I can't, say, yes, I can, God, because I know you will help me. Excuses are easy. Saying yes is hard. And sometimes Many times God asks us to say yes, where that might take us. We don't know. But we know God will go there with us. So can we, next time we feel God calling us, say yes as Moses did, and then follow where God leads us, where God leads us? I pray that we can.